So BovINE is a short for Beef Innovation Network Europe, and it's a European project. It's a thematic network project, which means that we are not doing our own research, but we are gathering all information and sharing it through all different channels. The most important thing in this project is that the farmer is really the central point. So we listen to the farmer, what the needs are, and based on what they think is important to know more about, then we will select some priority topics to work on for the next year. The selection of the priority topics, we do this together with all partners involved in the project. A very important factor also in the project is that we have the network managers. The network managers are members of the sector organizations that are really standing into practice, and they are a very good link between the farmers and the researcher. Because we also know that a lot of information from research is not always going to the farmer, and also the needs from the farmer are not always going to the researchers. So for us, it was really important to have this network manager. And they are also looking for the good practices per topic that we are working on. And these good practices come from practice. And for example, a good practice from Belgium can be very important for Ireland, for example, on how things are done related to beef systems. On the other hand, we also have the researchers. They are work package leaders. And per work package, I will show them in the next slide, we also have a thematic working group. And within these groups, we look for innovations. And these innovations come from literature, but of course, we try to look for innovations that are not too abstract. Otherwise, this innovation is not really interesting for the farmer. So the 4 themes that we are working on are socioeconomic resilience, animal health and welfare, production efficiency and meat quality, and environmental sustainability. So this year, I listed up the topics that we are working on this year. But for this webinar, it's organized from the work package on environmental sustainability. And one of the topics that we worked on last year was the reduction of enteric methane emissions. So this is why we chose the topic for this webinar. All information that is gathered, we share it through all different channels. And the most important channel is the BovINE Knowledge Hub. This is available for everyone, so everyone can just go on there and find all information. And then we also have all different other ways like this webinar, local magazines, also national and transnational meetings. So we have a lot of ways to share all the knowledge. At the end of this webinar, you will see a slide where you can find the links to, for example, the hub and the website and things like that. So during this webinar, first there will be an introduction on how methane is produced and what are the emissions related to beef systems. And on the other hand, we will also explain 3 different mitigation options. First, we will talk about fats. Then there will be explanation on different additives that can be used. And also the last part will be on the management of Youngstock. So how are enteric methane emissions produced? As everyone knows, a cow is eating grass, grain, all different types of feed, and this is coming into the rumen. In the rumen, there are some microbiota that is breaking down this feed, and some of the products can be volatile fatty acids that are produced. I will explain a little bit more in the next slide. But there is also carbon dioxide that is produced and hydrogen. And this carbon dioxide and hydrogen is formed into methane due to the methanogenic bacteria that are also available in the rumen. So actually the production of methane is a natural process. It is normal and it's just how the ruminant is working. For an adult cow, the average of methane is 200 to 500 grams per day. Beef cattle will be more on the lower end and dairy cattle will be more on the higher end. Then if we look to the volatile fatty acids, there are different volatile fatty acids like propionate. Propionate is a good volatile fatty acid because it will consume hydrogen. This means that less hydrogen is available in the rumen for the methanogenic bacteria, so less methane will also be produced. This propionate can be increased when you add more grain in your diet, more concentrates. So the starch-rich raw materials are interesting for this. On the other hand, you also have acetate and butyrate, and they will promote hydrogen. So it means that more hydrogen will be available in the rumen for the methanogenic bacteria, so more methane can be produced. And acetate and butyrate are promoted by raw materials that are high in carbohydrates. This is only saying something about the rumen fermentation. So concentrates in this story are interesting. However, the carbon footprint of the feed is not taken into account in this. So if we look to the emissions in the beef production systems, in general, if you just look into literature, there will be a broad range of what the real greenhouse gas emissions are. And this can be due to different methods to calculate these emissions, but it's also because there are different production systems. And not all systems will have the same amount of emissions. And here in this presentation, we will look further into what the origin of the calves can have an impact on, also the type of production system, the type of diet, and also what grazing can do in this. So if you look at the origin of the calves, if you have a calf coming from dairy cattle and then you fatten it, then you can expect a lower global warming potential. It can also have a positive effect on acidification and eutrophication on farm, lower energy use and lower land use. If you look at calves that come from beef cattle, then you see actually that the beef cow is a dominant contributor because she also has a low reproductive rate. And in the beef systems where everything is coming from beef, all emissions are also allocated to beef, while in a dairy system, the impact is partly attributed also to milk. So this is an emission that is not calculated into the beef. So if you look at this, it would be most interesting to have calves from a dairy system. However, also a consumer likes meat better if it really comes from a beef cattle and less if it comes from dairy cattle. So to counteract a little bit the problem for the consumer, you can also work with semen from beef cows, for example, or with dual purpose cows. And this will also increase the growth of the animals and then also have a better quality for the consumer. Then if you look at the type of production method, so here I will just look at organic versus conventional, then the global warming potential is slightly lower in organic systems, but it's similar. And this lower levels can be due to a lower fertilization use, because with this fertilizer, you will have more carbon dioxide emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. There is also a lower amount of concentrate used in organic systems. And the concentrate that is used is, in many cases, it's coming from local production. There is also a lower energy use, and all these things will help that organic systems seem a little bit better for the global warming potential. On the other hand, if you have a lower amount of concentrate, you will have higher methane emissions. This is as I explained before with the volatile fatty acids. And in an organic system, you can also have a higher acidification, and this is due to an inefficient land use and also a less efficient growth of the crops. Then if you look at the type of feed, so here we look at the difference between concentrate and a roughage-based diet. Then in a concentrate-based diet, the global warming potential can be lower because you have lower methane emissions. So the enteric methane emissions, and the growth rate of the calves will also be higher compared to the roughage-based systems, because here the finishing time will be longer and you will also have a lower finishing weight. Then this higher global warming potential in the roughage-based systems can also be due to high productive grasslands, because here the use of fertilizer is much higher compared to a concentrate-based system. And if you stay within this roughage-based system and you go to a low productive grassland, then the global warming potential will be even higher because you have a lower animal growth and also a lower reproduction rate. So within this roughage-based system, if you would switch from low productive grasslands to high productive grasslands, you can already influence your global warming potential in a positive way. Another thing that is also important in this concentrate-based system, it can be good for global warming if you look to the enteric emissions. However, in concentrate, you will also add more raw materials that are also good for human consumption. So this is also something that it's not wanted and is a negative factor for the concentrate-based systems. Then if you look at grazing, what kind of effect grazing can have is if you compare grazing with a stable based system, then at grazing you will have higher enteric emissions. And here again, this is due to the lower amount of concentrates and the volatile fatty acids. Then if you look to the forage types on a grazing system, then you can have, if you look at, for example, the more tropical forages, then you will have more methane emissions, enteric methane emissions. This because you have a higher amount of fiber in the crops, and this will decrease digestibility. Then also season has an effect. For example, in spring, the quality of the forage is much better compared to summer and fall. So in spring, you can also expect a lower methane emission from the animals. Then there is also a way to decrease the emissions, and that's by rotational grazing. Here in this graph, you can see the amount of methane that is emitted. And BMP stands for the best managed practices. So here what they did was they divided the whole field into different paddocks. And per paddock, the cattle stayed 1 to 3 days in there. And they measured the methane emissions. And you can see that by using the best managed practices, that the methane overall was always lower than if they compared it with conventional. So where the animals just stayed on the same field the whole year. So to conclude, if you just look at this numbers, the dairy-based system has a lower impact. There is a similar impact for organic versus conventional types of systems. The concentrate-based system has a lower global warming potential. However, there are still other factors to also look at that can be negative from these concentrate-based systems. And overall, the amount of studies is also limited. So it's also very difficult to compare one production system with another production system if you only have a few studies to base on. So then to continue with the rest of the webinar, there are different ways to mitigate the enteric methane emissions. You can divide it into 2 groups. You can do something with feed and you can do something with management. So for feed, you can add some additives in the diet, and then you can go specific to the active components of the plants, like the tannins or the essential oils or plant extracts, or you can look at chemical additives or synthetic additives. On the other hand, you can also add the complete feed ingredients, and then you can look at the seaweed, fat-rich feed ingredients like linseeds or whole plants that are, for example, rich in tannins. Then if you look at management, you can work a little bit with genetics to decrease the enteric methane. You can also manage your Youngstock better. As I explained before, you can also do something with the grazing systems or slightly change some things in the production system. But in this webinar, we will just focus on 3 things. So we will talk about fats, the feed ingredients and the additives. Then we'll also talk about all the other types of additives. And to end with, they will explain something more about how to manage your Youngstock a little bit better. So first of all, Joni will tell you something more about fats.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Joni van Mullem, and I'm a researcher at the Flanders Research Institute of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about fats and how they reduce the enteric methane emissions produced by beef cattle. Besides dietary fats, I will also talk about essential oils and what their effect is on enteric methane emissions. So first we are going to take a closer look to the dietary fats in cattle diets. One of the main reasons why farmers add fats to the diets of beef cattle is to increase the energy content of the diet. However, beside an increase in the energy density of the diet, fats have also the capacity to reduce enteric methane production. And in the next slides, we will take a closer look on the working mechanism of this methane reducing strategy by adding fats to the diet. So a first explanation of how this feeding strategy works is that the addition of fat results in a lower amount of fermentable organic matter. Fats will not be fermented in the rumen and will therefore not lead to the production of enteric methane. When we add fat to the diet, this fat will also replace another feed component in the diet, and mostly the replaced feed components contains fermentable carbohydrates, and by replacing them, this will lead to a reduction in the enteric methane emissions, but also fats have a coating effect on the fiber particles in the diet, which makes those fiber particles less available for fermentation in the rumen. All these effects make that the enteric methane emissions will be lower because of a lower amount of the fermentable organic matter. A second explanation for a lower enteric methane emission is that the addition of fats, dietary fats, leads to a higher production of propionic acid. This is due to a lower amount of structural carbohydrates because they partly replaced by the fats, but also because of the lower availability for fermentation because the fiber parts are coated by the fats and thus less available for fermentation. This all leads to less structural carbohydrates, which also result in a shift in the microorganisms to more propionic acid producing microorganisms, and this all leads to the production of more propionic acid. And like Riet already said, the production of propionic acid will act as an alternative hydrogen sink, which means that the hydrogen will be used for the production of propionic acid, and therefore the hydrogen will not be available anymore for the production of methane. So when we have more propionic acid, we will have less methane production. The third explanation for less methane is that dietary fats will lead to an inhibition of the ruminal microorganisms. Mostly the protozoa are affected by the addition of fat in the diet, and since protozoa are important producers of the hydrogen, their inhibition affects the total amount of hydrogen that is released into the rumen. And also, the methane-producing bacteria, the methanogens, are in a really close relationship with the protozoa, and that relationship that leads to a very efficient methane production, because the hydrogen can immediately be converted to methane, but when there are less protozoa or the protozoa are inhibited by the added fat to the diet, this methane production will be less efficient and lead to a lower production of methane. And a last explanation for a lower methane emission is due to the biohydrogenation of the unsaturated fatty acids. And the biohydrogenation is a process that will take place in the rumen. And it's the process where unsaturated fatty acids will be converted to saturated fatty acids. The main difference between the two types of fatty acids is the double bond in the carbon chain. This process is necessary because the unsaturated fatty acids have a larger negative influence on the microbiota in the rumen. So to lessen these adverse effects, this process needs to be performed into the rumen, and for this process hydrogen is needed. So the conversion of unsaturated fatty acids to saturated fatty acids works as an alternative hydrogen sink and leads to lower methane emissions. So when we add unsaturated fatty acids, this will lead to lower methane production. But however, this will be only responsible for a small reduction in the enteric methane, and this reduction is around 2–3% of the total methane production. So beside an insight in the working mechanism of this feeding strategy, it is also important to know what the influencing factors are. In other words, what is determining the size of the reduction. And the first influencing factor is the amount of fat. In the graph on this slide, you can see different experiments with their reduction in the methane production and the fat content of the diet that was tested. The trend in this graph is the higher the amount of fat in the diet, the higher the reduction will be. However, this should be interpreted very carefully, because a too high amount of fats can have detrimental effects, and in next slide I will talk a little bit more about it. And therefore the total amount of fat should be limited to maximal 6 to 7% of the total dry matter intake. So, like I just said, the amount of fat should be limited due to some side effects. The first side effect is with a too high amount of fat, the digestibility of the diet will be reduced. Also, the dry matter intake will be impaired when the fat content of the diet is too high, and both a lower digestibility and lower dry matter intake will lead to a decrease in the production, a decrease in growth, and this is an effect that we certainly not want, so we have to limit the total amount of fat in the diet. Here is a graph that shows the effect on the dry matter intake. With an increasing amount of fat, we can see that the dry matter intake will decrease. However, a small decrease can be met by the higher energy amount of the diet, but too high amount of fat has to be avoided because that will lead to a large decrease in dry matter intake and with reduced productivity as a consequence. A second influencing factor is the source of fat. Like I already explained, there are two main types of fatty acids: the saturated fatty acids, such as palm oil and coconut oil, and there are the other main group are the unsaturated fatty acids, such as rapeseed oil or linseed oil. Both fats are can reduce the enteric methane production. However, the unsaturated fatty acids have a larger impact on the microorganisms in the rumen, which could lead to a higher reduction in the enteric methane production. Although most fats will reduce the enteric methane emissions, we also need to look at a broader climate impact. It's not only the emissions from the animals that are important, also the emissions that derive from the production of the fats as a feed that are also important to consider when we are going to adjust our diets for a lower climate impact. Here in this graph, you can see that the CO2 emissions, the CO2 emissions of palm oil are much larger than rapeseed. So that is also an aspect that has to be accounted for. A third influencing factor is the form of the dietary lipid. We have raw materials or oil. Raw materials will release their fatty acids much slower in the rumen than oil, and this leads to a lower reducing potential of raw materials compared to oil. In this slide, you can see an example of an experiment where 4 treatments were compared with each other: a control treatment, a crude linseed treatment, an extruded linseed treatment, and a linseed oil treatment. This was an experiment that was carried out with dairy cattle, and the effect on the enteric methane emissions was measured. And the results showed that the linseed oil has the greatest capacity to reduce the enteric methane emissions, and that this capacity was much larger than the raw material, the crude linseed. Another example of a diet or an experiment where fat was added. It was an experiment with Charolais fattening bulls, and a part of the concentrate was replaced by extruded linseed. This replacement resulted in a fat content of 4.4% compared to 2.4% in the control treatment, and this resulted in a reduction in the enteric methane emissions of 19%. However, also the composition of the diet is a very important influencing factor. Not in every diet will this strategy lead or result in a reduction of the same size. The addition of fats have a larger effect in concentrate-rich diets compared to roughage-rich diets, and this is mainly due to the amount of dietary fiber and the amount of starch in the diet. But not only the concentrate and the roughage ratio is an important factor, also in different roughage diets we can see different outcomes with the addition of fat. For example, a same amount of extruded linseed can result in a reduction in a maize-based diet, but will not result in a reduction when it's added to a grass silage-based diet. So, beside the dietary fats, there is a lot of research focusing on essential oils, and essential oils are complex aromatic substances derived from plants. It's the chemical compound in the plant that is responsible for a specific scent or a specific color. Here we have in the pictures an oregano, lemongrass and garlic, and these three essential oils derived from these plants are intensively investigated on their effect on the enteric methane emissions. You can have essential oil from individual plants or individual oils, but you can have also blends of different essential oils, and both are intensively investigated at the moment. So there are a lot of experiments and a lot of trials with essential oils. On the one hand, there are many in vitro experiments where the effect on the enteric methane emissions is investigated in a laboratory on a lab scale. And a lot of these publications of these experiments are showing a large potential of these essential oils to reduce the methane emissions. However, in the in vivo experiments, these promising results are not seen. The results are very variable. Sometimes there is a reduction. Most of the times, the reduction cannot be confirmed to what was found in vitro. So a lot of research is still needed, and especially for beef cattle, there is a lot of research needed to get more insight in the effect of the essential oils on enteric emissions, but also to know the working mechanism, because currently that is also still a question, how the essential oils will lead to a reduction in the enteric methane emissions. So thank you all. This was my presentation, and if there are any questions, you can ask them in the chat box, in the question box, and I like to answer them at the end of this webinar.
So, my name is Gemma. I'm a researcher from I'm going to talk to you today about the different types of
Yeah, so between 2 and 12% of the energy that cattle get from feed is not available for growth. It's lost as methane. And in beef calves that are destined for the food chain, around half of the animal's lifetime methane emissions are emitted in the final 4 to 6 months of life, so in that finishing period when the animal's being fatted for slaughter. So during this time, the animal is likely being fed more intensively, and there's an opportunity there to supplement the diet with a methane reducing feed additive at that stage. Oh, there we go. Okay, enteric fermentation is a two-stage process, and Riet and Joni have actually covered a lot of this quite neatly already, so I won't go into too much detail. So yeah, during fermentation, microbes and fungi produce hydrogen and carbon dioxide, and then another set of microbes called archaea use that hydrogen carbon dioxide to produce methane. So there are several different opportunities along this pathway to interrupt the methane producing process. And I've identified sort of 4 ways that that can be done here. So by diverting hydrogen to another chemical pathway, by inhibiting methane producing microbes, by changing fermentation products, and by suppressing rumen microbes. And over the next few slides, I'm going to look at these different strategies and different feed additives that we can use to achieve them, and sort of the pros and cons of those different feed additives as well. Okay, so the first strategy was diverting hydrogen to another chemical pathway. And the feed additive I've identified here is nitrate. It was the most effective additive sort of in this category. It's normally fed as calcium nitrate, which is a salt most commonly used for fertilizing soil. What it does is mop up that hydrogen and use it to produce ammonia instead of methane. And actually that chemical pathway where we use the hydrogen to produce ammonia from nitrate is actually, it uses less energy, so there's more energy available for the animal for growth than from the normal methane production pathway. We've done a little bit of work using nitrate at SRUC with beef cattle. We found that animals on a high forage diet had about a 20% reduction in methane when nitrate was included in the diet, but there was no effect on concentrate. So as Joni was saying, with some of the other dietary interventions, it's base diet specific as to the effect that the additive has. One big problem with feeding nitrate is that it can be toxic to the animal. It can actually lead to quite severe health effects. The nitrate can bind to hemoglobin in the blood and effectively suffocate the animal. So we would never recommend this as a feed additive or strategy that we can implement now, because there's no good way of regulating or safe way of regulating the dosage that the animal gets yet. You know, there's potential that maybe you could develop a bolus type system, so a capsule that would be put into the animal's rumen that would release the nitrate at a specific rate that would make that safe, but we haven't advanced that technology to that stage yet. Okay, so the second strategy was inhibiting methane producing microbes. I'm going to highlight 3-nitroxypropanol here, or 3-NOP for short. So this is a feed additive that is quite far along the way to commercialization. What it does is it inhibits an enzyme produced by the archaea in that final stage of fermentation. So it binds to this enzyme and changes the shape and effectively just blocks the production of methane by the methanogens. Looking through the literature, on average, it has a reduction potential of about 30% of methane, but that is really quite variable between studies, mostly just because of the different dosages that are used and the way it's administered to the animal. So whether it's incorporated into a compound or top dressed, or so there's lots of different experimental factors that have influenced what we see in terms of efficacy in the literature. And again, this is also base diet dependent. So this was a study by Bias et al. I pulled the results from. And you can see the effect increased with dosage, but it had a bigger effect on the high concentrate diets than in the forage-based diets, which was sort of in contrast to what we found with the nitrates. In this category as well, I want to talk about bromoform. Feeding seaweed to cattle to reduce methane emissions has been in the media quite a lot recently. The active compound that is, sort of the biggest active agent within the seaweed that's reducing the methane is bromoform. It's found in bigger concentrations than red seaweeds, red species, and particularly in one species, the Spargopsis taxiformis, which is native to Australia. it's shown quite a big potential to reduce methane emissions in lab-based studies. There's been very few in vivo studies. There's been one in the States and one in Australia, both of which have shown reductions. And we're actually carrying out quite a large trial at SRUC at the moment with asparagopsis. So we have 80 cattle that are receiving that treatment at the moment. We're also going to be looking at effects on production, health-related issues, and meat quality as well. So it's quite a large body of work looking at in more detail about how feeding bromoform in the form of seaweed can impact on a wide variety of different factors. There's still quite a few things that are unknown about feeding seaweed. So one study found that bromoform was carcinogenic. This was a study where the bromoform was fed to mice at really quite high dosage levels and was found to lead to cancerous tumours. In cattle, we're actually feeding the bromoform in such tiny amounts that it's unlikely to have any effect. At the moment, or in the trial that we're conducting at SRUC, the dosages are, or the seaweed is fed at 0.5% of the total diet, and the bromoform is actually just a small percentage of that as well. So these really tiny dosages are unlikely to have any impacts on either the animal's health or human health when the meat enters the production system. And that's again something that needs to be investigated further. Bromoform can also damage the ozone, and there was some concern that if we were to farm seaweed for use to produce feed additives, that some leakage to the atmosphere could occur, and this would have some knock-on effects to the ozone. There is some thinking that instead of directly feeding the seaweed, we could manufacture the bromoform and just feed the chemical, the active compound, to the animal directly. Whether that's feasible or not, I don't know. It's something else that needs to be investigated here. And also the trials have been quite short term, so we need to look at how long that the seaweed is active for, or the bromoform. Do the microbes in the rumen adapt to it and so make it ineffective in reducing methane anymore? So there's a lot of questions still surrounding the use of bromoform. The third strategy was changing fermentation products. So there is a product, Monensin, which is used quite extensively in the US. It's an antibiotic growth promoter, and it favours the production of propionate. So as Joni and Riet were saying, that the propionate mops, or it uses up hydrogen in its production. So whereas acetate produces hydrogen, so if we can push the production of propionate over acetate, then we're using up more hydrogen, so there's less available for methane production later on. However, growth promoters are currently banned in the EU, so this strategy isn't likely to be implemented anytime soon. So the fourth strategy was suppressing rumen microbes, and Joni spoke a bit about essential oils before. Effectively, what they do is they can burst cell walls, so we're reducing the population of microbes in the rumen, which means there are less microbes available to produce methane. There's a wide variety of different essential oils that you will find talked about in the literature, as well as all the different blends, as Joni said. Some a lot of them have shown some effect in lab-based studies, less so in live animals. We have done some work with a blend of essential oils at SRUC. Excuse me. Where we did two separate trials. The first was with dairy beef cattle, and we saw an 8 to 9% reduction in methane emissions that was sustained over a 16-week period. We then ran a very similar trial with beef animals from a suckler herd and found no reduction in methane. So that just serves to highlight how variable the results can be. I think, yeah, as Joni said, most of them are short term, so there's still a lot of investigation to do around the efficacy of essential oils. There are a couple of different blends that are going through approval as methane reducing additives through EFSA at the moment. One is Mutral and one is Aglim Ruminant. The EFSA process to get that accreditation is quite rigorous, and it's quite a long process, and they have to go through lots of trials, so that's still ongoing. And just some final thoughts to conclude with. So there are still some issues around toxicity and safety of some additives to be overcome and investigated. I think Joni touched on this before, but we need to think about more than just the methane mitigation and look upstream at the manufacture of these feed additives. So for plant-based additives, for example, we should be looking at the emissions associated with producing them, but also the downstream emissions. So things like manure management, how do these additives affect emissions from manure embedding, etc. Looking at the whole system from production of the additive right through to management of the waste to find the true effect of those different additives on the environment. And none are actually yet approved through EFSA as feed additives to reduce methane. Some are approved as sensory additives, or they may be approved for other purposes, but not specifically for methane reducing. Yeah, so there's some way to go in this area of research till we get some products that are approved particularly for methane reduction. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Gemma. So in the last part of this webinar, I will talk about Youngstock management as a strategy to reduce enteric emissions from beef production. My name is Karen Goossens and I'm a colleague of Riet and Joni at the ILVO Animal Science Unit. So as explained by Riet and the others, cattle are ruminants, so they emit methane due to fermentation in the rumen. But the methane intensity is related to the physiological stage of the animal and to the dry matter intake. So it is obvious that young animals emit less methane than, for example, finishing bulls or suckler cows. The aim of the beef sector is to produce quality meat in the most efficient way. And efficiency can be seen as an economic indicator, but also as a sustainability indicator. But thus economic and environmental sustainability can go together. During this talk, I will focus on the economic and environmental impact of 3 different Youngstock management strategies. The first strategy is the reduction of the age of first calving. So female calves grow into heifers that calve for the first time between the age of 2 and 3 years. The average age of calving is around 30 months. However, for some breeds, a first calving at the age of 24 months is feasible. And fertility is strongly related to growth, so it is important to be sufficiently mature and grown up at the age of first calving, or at the time of first calving. For Belgian blue heifers, for example, a live weight of about 600 kilograms at the age of first calving is desired. So a heifer has to grow on average more than 750 grams per day in the first 2 years of her life to reach that goal. And the age of first calving is an important economic parameter, influencing profitability of the suckler farm, but reducing the age of first calving allows also to reduce the number of heifers present on the farm. It improves productivity of the animal and can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to beef production. A theoretical calculation shows that methane emission during Youngstock rearing phase can be significantly reduced. For example, reducing the age of first calving from 28 to 26 months can reduce the methane emission during the rearing phase, in theory, by 11%. Calving at the age of 24 months instead of 30 months can reduce the methane emission during the rearing phase about 30%. But this is a theoretical example, and it only considers enteric methane emission during the rearing phase. In the live beef carbon project, IDEL made calculations for the French suckler farms with seasonal calvings, and they studied two scenarios. In the control situation, heifers calved at the age of 35 months. In the first scenario, the number of calvings on the farm was kept equal. And by reducing the age of first calving to 30 or respectively 24 months, the number of livestock units on the farm can be reduced. So the number of non-productive animals to productive animals lowers. This secures, for example, forage provision. It can make land available for other crops or other purposes, and it reduces the number of animals in the barn with possible positive effects on animal welfare and costs. However, calving at 24 months also requires a better growth and more intensive feeding. So this results in higher amounts of concentrate use, and taken together, this results in a net carbon footprint on the farm, and a reduction of the net carbon footprint of the farm between 8 and 14%. So this is less prominent than when only the enteric emissions were considered. In the second scenario, the number of livestock units stayed the same, but the reduced age of first calving increases the number of calvings per year. So it improved the productivity of the farm. And this resulted in more animals of the farm. This scenario had a lower impact on the net carbon footprint at farm level, as the increasing number of animals counterbalanced the decreasing emissions per animal. So heifers can calve at a younger age, but also bulls can be slaughtered at a younger age. And what is the effect on profitability and environmental sustainability of slaughter at a younger age? So we know that weight gain and feed efficiency of bulls lower with increasing age. So at a certain age, the growth curve that you can see here in the graph, it flattens out. And that happens around the age of 20 months in most breeds. So when we again make a theoretical comparison for bulls of the Belgian blue breed, slaughtered at the age of 18 months or 22 months, we can see that the dry matter intake, for example, increases with increasing age and weight. And Belgian blue bulls require a quite intensive diet, so the majority of the diet consists of concentrates. So the concentrate intake will go up at the end of the finishing phase. With increasing age, also the weight at slaughter will be higher, but also the feed costs at slaughter will be higher, about 350 euros extra per animal. The gross income, due to the higher carcass weight, will be higher, but this difference will not cover the extra feed cost, so the net income will be lower. And due to the longer growth phase and the increasing dry matter intake in the last months of the finishing phase, the methane emissions until slaughter will be about 22% higher. And in the third approach, I would like to discuss the effect of the reduction of the calving interval. In theory, a cow can have one calf per year. The average calving interval is about 420 days. What will be the effect of a reduced calving interval on both economic and enteric emissions? So again, we made theoretical calculation for the Belgian situation with Belgian blue suckler cows. And it showed that a reduction of the calving interval from the average of 420 days in Belgium to the optimum of 385 days, so a reduction of 35 days, this will reduce the feed cost per cow with about 50 euros. So with an average methane emission of about 250 grams per day per suckler cow, and a reduction of 35 days, this results in an 8% reduction of methane emission per cow per calving interval. And in the live beef carbon project, IDEL made a similar calculation for French suckler cow farms with the Charolais breed. The Charolais breed is known for good fertility characteristics, and the average age of calving is around 390 days. But this interval can be reduced, for example, with 15 days to the optimum of 375 days. This results in an increase of the gross income with 4% and an about 2% reduction of the net CO2 emissions per kilogram of gross live meat production. So taken together, we can conclude that an improved Youngstock management not only results in a better profitability of the farm, but also in a lower carbon footprint of beef production. Farmers have to work on a reduced age of first calving, optimized slaughter age, and a reduced calving interval. And the French Livestock Institute, IDEL, has developed in collaboration with its partners a tool, the Cap d'Uzière, and this is a tool to reduce the carbon footprint of dairy and beef production. It is a multi-criteria calculator that measures or calculates the greenhouse gas emission intensities associated with a farm, and it identifies possible options for mitigation. And we simulated what the effect of the different management strategies was, and it can be simulated with this Cap d'Uzière tool and have indeed a positive effect. I would like to thank you for attending this webinar, and I will hand over to the question section.
Well, thank you very much to our speakers. And I see that we have a lot of questions in our questions box that have been sent in. If anybody still has a question they would like to ask, please do find the questions box in the panel, in the GoToWebinar panel, and please type your question in there. All of our speakers do have access to these questions. So is there one that someone would like to tackle first? Otherwise, I can pick one. Oh, right, okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I was going to say I can answer the question on the carbon footprint. If you look at the complete carbon footprint, it's indeed, if you just look at the enteric emissions, that concentrates will have a better influence because you have lower methane emissions. But if you would look at the complete carbon footprint of concentrate-based diets compared to roughage-based diets, that the carbon footprint can be completely different, and it can be higher for the concentrates because raw materials can come from wherever in the world. Often soybean is used, so then the transport emissions, land use will all be higher. Also fertilizer and pesticide use are higher in grain productions compared to forages. However, I also explained during the presentation that if you go to an organic farming system, then you will look for raw materials more locally, so then you have less emissions related to this transport and things like that. So it will all depend to compare all these different systems with each other. But indeed, if you look at a complete carbon footprint of a feed, then this can be different, that concentrates will have a bigger impact than the roughage-based diets.
Just to add a wee bit to that, in some systems, or using Scotland as an example, a lot of beef producers actually use grain from distilleries, so it's a waste, a byproduct that's feeding into the beef production. So yeah, that lowers the footprint a bit as well. So you're right, the source of the grain is really important.
Great, thank you. We've got another question in here that says, what about the ruminally protected fatty acids? Is it effective to reduce methane?
I think that's a question that I can answer. Ruminally protected fatty acids can have a small effect on the enteric methane emissions due to the fact, as I also said in the presentation, that when these ruminal protected fatty acids are added to the diet, they replace other fermentable organic matter, and since fats and also ruminally protected fats are not fermented in the rumen, there will be less enteric methane production. However, the other aspects of the working mechanism, such as the effects on the microbiota in the rumen, are less present because the fat is protected in the rumen, and studies with these types of fats showed a small or no reduction in the enteric methane. So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you, Joni. So we have another question in which says, what about acidosis when using additives to reduce CH4 emissions?
I think the only time when acidosis has really been a problem is in these really high concentrate diets. I haven't come across any in any other additives.
Perfect, thank you. So the next question we have in is, are essential oils potentially more effective than fats in reducing methane?
I think the evidence around essential oils is still too patchy and variable, whereas the evidence around fats is quite solid. I don't know if you want to expand on that, Joni.
Yes, no, I think that's correct. The results are very variable, and what's found in vitro is not always supported with in vivo. What's found in vitro is not always supported with results in vivo, while that's in dietary fats we have a bunch of evidence that it definitely works, which is still missing with the essential oils.
Thank you. On a similar vein there, then we've got another question that says or asks about the comparison of the effect with managing livestock compared to the addition of fats in diet. So is there a significant difference one way or the other there? Have they been compared?
To be honest, I think it's difficult to compare both strategies because management of the Youngstock is something that can be done just to increase the profitability of the farm, and it's good that it can be combined with other strategies in the adult life. So I think it's not one or the other, but the calculations I showed were theoretical calculations. So when you look at the ideal results, the final effect will be less strong than the theoretical calculations, because it can have drawbacks on other parameters. For example, some farms work with seasonal calvings, so it's difficult to reduce the age of first calving or the calving interval without having effects on other management parameters on the farm. On top, I think that Feeding strategies, for example, fats or essential oils, can also be implemented in the early life, and some studies are even investigated the programming effect of those strategies later in life. So if one can program the rumen microbiome to be more efficient later in life, this can be a Youngstock strategy that has effect even later in life.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you. So we have another question here, which asks, is there a significant difference in the cost of the additives for the food? Do they increase the cost of of rearing the cattle?
It's difficult to say. A lot of these products aren't commercially available. Some, like, I don't know, fertilizer you would imagine could be bought quite cheaply for the nitrates, but in terms of comparisons to other additives, I don't know. Does someone else have any ideas?
I think it depends on the type of product and the dose you have to use to have the effect. So also for some products, the price is not known because the product is not on the market yet. So it's difficult to say indeed.
Yeah, a product can look very expensive, but then the dose is much lower than another product where you have to dose much higher. So it's all difficult to compare also with each other.
Of course. Well, as you've all said during this, a lot of this is still very upcoming and forefront of research, and there's more that needs to be done, and it's very exciting that it hopefully will all continue to be being researched and implemented as appropriate. So that brings us to the end of the questions that we have in at the moment. If there are any more questions, please pop them in quite quickly and maybe we can answer them. Oh, okay. We do have one more that's just come in now that says, is it correct to conclude, based on your presentations, that it is more environmentally sustainable to produce beef in an intensive system with concentrates and more animals per area, reducing the first calf and lowering the age of slaughter, than to produce beef in a more extensive system based on grass and large areas of mature animals?
Yeah, this is something that comes up a lot. I think a lot of the time we get too focused on climate change and it's all about reducing methane, reducing methane, reducing methane, but you have to look at it in the wider picture. And we know extensive systems have benefits in terms of biodiversity, and grazing can be managed to be beneficial for biodiversity. Yeah, so there are lots of pros to extensive systems, and it needs to be looked at in a more balanced way, than just always focusing on climate change all the time. But you are right. Intensive systems just are less methane intensive.
I would like to add that we haven't discussed the competition between feed and food yet. Ruminants are grazers and they can consume grass, which is not consumed or not possible to be consumed by humans. So I think they have an important role in the production system. And I think we have to find an optimal balance between different production systems to make the maximal use of grassland that is not possible for other crops or other products.
Absolutely. So that quite nicely leads us on to what I will take as our last question, which is there a golden rule to reduce CH4 emissions, keep animal health, and have a sustainable production and still have profit, which I think is the golden question, really.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things are win-win. If your animals are healthy, they're going to be more productive. If you're feeding them well on diets that are, keeping their growth high, it's also reducing methane and increasing your profits. Yes, there's lots of things that in the management of the farm that are not just reducing the methane emissions, but reducing inefficiencies in the system and improving profit. So, yeah, in reducing emissions doesn't always equal higher costs. Sometimes it's you're gaining on the other side as well and increased profit because you've improved the health and welfare of your animals.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So as I said, that was our last question there. So I'd just like to once again thank all of the speakers. So Riet, Joni, Gemma and Karen for the presentations this afternoon. They were very much appreciated and lots of fabulous questions there from the audience. So thank you. I'd just like you all to invite you all now to connect with the BovINE project. Please do visit our website as well as join the Knowledge Hub, which was explained a little bit earlier, and is an online repository of all the good practices and research innovations that are coming from the project. So it's a great source of knowledge and information. Please do also sign up to the mailing list, which you can access via our website. And of course, follow us on social media, and our handles are there. If you do have any questions or you would like to contact the BovINE team, you can do so through these channels, and please do. I'd also like to invite you, if you haven't already, to register for our next big event. This is our Sustainability of European Beef Farming Challenges and Solutions. And this public event is happening on the 22nd of June, which is next week, between 9:30 and 5:30 CEST. There are links available on our website as well as across our social channels, enabling you to register for this event. And there's a short agenda there, but there is far more information online for you to look at. So once again, I'd just like to say thank you to all of our attendees and thank you to all of our speakers. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at future BovINE events. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.